Hello, everybody. Luke Schulte, field agronomist for Beck's Hybrids. Along with me today is Jared Chester. Jared's part of our PFR team. We just want to take a moment to address what are some of those things that we can no longer afford or certainly can't afford to get wrong, given the current change in our commodity market. You know, one of those management practices that we can no longer afford to do is to plant every hybrid at the same population. A few years back, we incorporated population trials into our dealer plots. Not all of them, but quite a few across the state. You can see we wrote a variable rate planting prescription for 28, 32, and 36,000, all within 30-inch rows. And a couple different learnings developed as a result of our findings over the last couple of years. One, certainly with the commodity market recession, is we've seen that favoritism towards more hybrids than 2 years ago actually favor more moderate to lower plant populations. In fact, one of our co-workers actually broke it down to what does that result to in a cost per bag potential savings. And what he found is if you look at our top 15 selling hybrids, just dropping our population from say 32 to 30,000, or you name the number, that 2,000 seeds per acre, fewer seeds per acre, resulting in almost a $20 a bag seed savings. Now, it's not just about spending less, it's about netting more, right? And as you can see by the data in front of you, you can see how we constructed these plots, but also how to interpret the data. We're not going to show you every one of these hybrids because your dealer has that information. But the second learning was what was really neat. And it's kind of a result of both this research as well as our root reveal research, where we're trying to better understand root architecture, root mass, and so forth. And what we've learned is the broader that root mass, or the more horizontal or balanced that crown root system is, the more it favors more moderate to lighter plant populations. And then conversely, the more vertical that root system, that crown root system develops, the more it actually responds favorably to higher plant populations. And I like it to humans. You know, if we put 3 of us in a 10 by 10 foot elevator, we're probably fairly comfortable. But if you put 12 or 13 of us in that same 10 by 10 elevator, we get pretty uncomfortable. Those plant roots really don't want to interact. They don't want to touch one another. They don't want to compete with one another. And those broader, or what we call balanced, the horizontal root systems are going to more quickly interfere, touch, and cause stress to one another. The thicker we plant them, we'll certainly expand on that and certainly exacerbate that. But then conversely, those vertical root systems like a 5530, like a 5794, we can push those a little tighter because they're not as quickly going to interfere with one another. So just some things we've learned, and really gives me the confidence that if we pair the right population with the hybrid, we can not only maximize yield potential, but more importantly, especially now, maximize profitability. So if you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you, contact your dealer and ask them what is the ideal population range per hybrid, and be prepared. It likely isn't the same for all of them.
Next topic's around planting depth. So in PFR, we found 2 inches on corn, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches on soybeans. It's kind of that sweet spot for planting depth. With the caveat, if we get late, we get dry, odds are we're probably going to go deeper to make sure we're putting that seed in adequate moisture. But to get started for the spring, 2 inches on corn is what we like to be at. So got a couple tips we want to share around planting depth. The first one is actually done in the shop. Once you get done going through the planter, making all your adjustments and changes for the year, get everything put back together, and then set that planter down on the concrete on the disc openers. And what we're doing is we're going to calibrate that planter for depth, with the whole goal of being making sure that row to row we're exactly the same across the whole planter. So to do that, we got to simulate our planting depth. So you can use, for example, a 2x4 with a piece of plywood, 1/2-inch piece of plywood screwed to it to represent that 2-inch depth. On this planter, on our corn planter here at London PFR, we've got conceal on there, so we actually can't slide that 2x6 and plywood underneath it. So to simulate that 2-inch depth, we actually have some 2-inch pieces of steel here. And so what you do, set it down on the concrete on the disc openers, set your depth handle, your T-handle to the deepest setting, and then set your depth gauges underneath both gauge wheels. And then move your T-handle up to where it's tight. So you can see that we got a little bit of movement, so it could almost go another notch. It's kind of that in between. There, we're pretty tight. So now we're set at 2 inches, and then we're going to pull those out, go to the next row unit, and continue that across the planter. A couple other tips I wanted to share around planting depth. The first one is if you're doing tillage right ahead of the planter. So if you're running a field cultivator right ahead of that planter and you don't get a rain to settle that ground back out, you actually have to plant a little bit deeper than 2 inches. We'll have to add 1/4 to 1/2 inch of depth. And the reason why is once you get that first rain and all that air actually gets compressed back out of that soil, you actually need to have that seed a little bit deeper to get that ideal final depth of 2 inches. The other tip is for you guys planting a little bit faster or utilizing some high-speed planters. And the tip is make sure you're checking your planting depth at your planting speed. What I mean by that is if you're planting, say, 7 or 8 mile an hour, you really need to stop. And when you start digging and checking for seed, don't go right behind the planter. Actually walk over a pass or two to make sure that you're checking seed at your actual planting depth. And the reason why is, especially as we go faster, sometimes we actually run out of downforce and it can affect our planting depth. So we want to make sure that we're checking our depth at the actual speed. So just a few tips to help you get going this spring in terms of depth.
Another management practice we want to be very aware of, particularly times like now, is early accessibility of nitrogen to corn. We all know that nitrogen's critically important to corn, but actually nitrogen accessibility by about 4-leaf corn is very vital and impactful to pollination. I think much of that can be seen if we look at our nitrogen rate study. What I'd like you to focus on in the screen in front of you is the 2 treatments that are highlighted or surrounded by the yellow and the green rectangle. The primary difference between these 2 treatments is how and how much nitrogen was applied with the planter. On the far left is 30 pounds of nitrogen on one side of the row. On that treatment in the green rectangle on the right, same total volume of nitrogen of 190 pounds, but now we've simply shifted more of that nitrogen to be applied with the planter, 60 pounds, and then less with side dress. And you can see in multi-location data, the advantage was almost 5 bushel, 4.7 bushel, or about $20 if we look at current commodity markets. We look at the same data in 2 years at London in our predominant clay soils, the advantage was greater, a little over 7 bushel. But I think the impact that early nitrogen accessibility has to pollination can actually be proven if we look at some pictures that were taken from some of our hybrid testing trials. Okay? So in these trials, they're planted by research planters. We do not utilize 2x2, so we just utilize in furrow. And then we utilize the nitrogen practices of the plot cooperator. So that can vary. So let's first go to genera. These 2 pictures were taken of the same plant, same day. You can see the practices above, it was in furrow, but the first significant amount of nitrogen wasn't applied till more of a side dress timing, okay? And if you focus on those plants, it's about the first day of pollen shed, and yet we don't have any silks that are coming out of that ear shoot. So we're gonna have some pollen wasted. We go back days later and we look at the success, or therefore the lack of success of pollination. You can see, unfortunately, because we started shedding pollen before the silks were out, we had a significant amount of tip back. And we look at the performance of 6235 in this particular plot, it didn't fare too well. It was below the plot average. But now let's look at the same hybrid at Arcanum, where the nitrogen practices are very different. At Arcanum, the grower utilizes pre-plant ammonia, so early accessibility nitrogen is plentiful. But look at those pictures again. Look how well they match up. It's approximately the first day of pollen shed, and we've got about a 3/4 inch length of silk. So they're really matching up very, very well. And as you can see by a performance standpoint, it was well above the plot average. That's the influence that early nitrogen has on overall pollination. We have a direct impact to that by choosing how we apply that first nitrogen. So what I would recommend is think about considering 60 pounds with the planter. I realize for many of you probably pragmatically can't stop the planter that frequently to fill. So if you're going to utilize a weed and feed in in conjunction with the planter or stand alone, keep in mind a weed and feed or urea application, because it's less concentrated, not quite as efficient, we're probably going to have to bump those rates to see the same effect as we saw in that nitrogen rate study to pollination. So just some things to consider or to keep in mind as this commodity market has shifted. We certainly can't afford to sacrifice yield, but at the same time, cannot throw caution in the wind when it comes to inputs and input selection. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call. We appreciate you tuning in.